Welcome to Structuring Your Classroom for Success, Expectations, and Procedures. This is week 5 in the Behavior and Classroom Management online course. And today we're going to talk about educative behavior management. Here are some references that would be important ones for you to keep in mind. They built the foundation for the slide presentation that we will be going through. The objectives of today's lesson is to describe proactive strategies for preventing problem behavior and setting the stage for quality instruction to occur. That means designing classroom space. We will actually cover that topic next week in our presentation. Setting a practical schedule and establishing classroom expectations and determining classroom procedures. So, what are the prerequisites to effective classroom management? One of the first things that we need to think about are appropriate and relevant academic curriculum. Okay, we need curriculum that meets the individual needs of all students. We also need to perceive students as important and meaningful, or ones that students perceive as important and meaningful. So, appropriate goals in curricula that are fair, functional, and meaningful to the student are important. Uh, Oftentimes, inappropriate expectations and curricula generate frustration, dissatisfaction, rebellion in our students. That's why we hear statements such as, "This is hard, I don't like this, why do I have to do this?" All of us have heard those comments at some time in our career. I'm going to turn this down just a little bit. Okay, now there are some mistakes we make as teachers, and they're important to keep in mind as we begin to look at planning for the school year. One is that we assume that students know what's expected of them. This is something that we need to be very cautious of. Okay, we need to explicitly teach the rules because for some students that absence of clear rules or vaguely stated rules are going to cause more challenges and problems for the student as well as for us as the teacher. The other thing that we sometimes do is we punish students for their failure to exhibit a behavior that they don't know how to perform. Okay, so we have to be very careful and uh, consider the fact that some students do not comply with a rule because they don't know how. It's not that they're not willing to do so. At one point, as a consultant, I was called into a building and asked to work with a student who was having problems on the playground. I went out and observed that student, and he was playing Foursquare with a number of other students. What happened on a daily basis was that these students would make up their own rules as they played Foursquare. And Philip was someone who didn't understand nor did he tolerate the fact that these rules were continually changing. I remember asking the students if I could play and asking them to share with me, what are the rules? You know, why do I get put out during Foursquare? And this student was doing the same thing and he didn't. Okay, they made the rules up. So consequently, a lot of frustration occurred for this particular student. Okay, and the duty that was in on the playground or the supervisor would come over because Philip would get so upset and he would begin to tantrum, push, hit, kick the other boys, and then be reprimanded for that behavior. Uh, taken to the office. This was a regular kind of situation that was happening. Okay. In all fairness, Philip was being punished for his performance, and it was not because he didn't want to comply with the rules that were set up for the Foursquare, but he didn't understand them because they kept changing. So we need to be careful as we think about setting up rules for our classroom, that they're consistent and that we explicitly teach them so all students know and understand, and this will increase the likelihood that they'll be performed correctly. Okay. Some of the causes of noncompliance. Sometimes it may be that a student's decision is to not follow a rule or direction. And we see this when a student states, "No, I will not do it." Typically, it's because they choose not to. Okay. It may indicate that the student doesn't know what behavior is expected, such as Philip. He didn't know what behavior was expected during Foursquare. Or it may be that the student lacks the skills to exhibit the desired behavior. So let's take just a few minutes and look at setting up a practical schedule. Okay, this is going to be a critical aspect of and prerequisite to your classroom management system at the beginning of the year. This plan should be flexible and it should be designed to serve the educational needs of your students. Classroom teachers need to allow priority time at the start of the school year before students return to develop a well organized schedule. In developing an elementary schedule, we want to list all of the school-wide events. We want to look at predetermined periods allocated to specialists. We want to, if we're team teaching, we want to plan a schedule with our participating teacher. Then we want to look at fixed events and uh, put them in an order for the subjects and activities that we're going to teach, and then construct the master schedule. So it's going to be really important as a new teacher that you get all of the different pieces of information together before you begin to develop your schedule. And remember, your schedule is going to rely upon what others are doing in the building as well. For elementary classrooms, during the first 3 days of the school year, this is your time to begin to build activities and a foundation for your students. So think about this as more of an orientation. So not only do you want to make students welcome, you want to teach what are the expectations, the procedures within your classroom. Talk about how you use the classroom, the building. Um, think about ways that you can motivate students. Find out what they are um, most excited about and what might work well as a reinforcer. And this is also a time that you're going to begin to test and test students and develop instructional groups for them. When I think about developing the schedule and building around orientation for students in the first couple weeks of school, I'm reminded of a young man whose parent called me once and said, "Would you please take and show Sean where the restroom is?" Okay, it hadn't dawned on me because this was a middle schooler that I needed to take the students on a tour of a building. But most certainly, this is something that we ought to do as a teacher is walk the entire building. Find out where everything is at and what are the expectations within these different areas in the library, on the playground, in the cafeteria. So this is a really good activity to think about including at the first of the year. Block schedules are designed often in secondary schools, and they're set up so that you can have more than the traditional 60-minute period of time, and it allows for more group projects and extensive activities that focus on uh, integrating different subject areas such as math and science or re, uh, literature and writing. There are some strategies to keep in mind when you're looking at block schedule, and again, they're ones that are conducive to working with all students. You need to know what the students' learning rates are. Um, Create active learning within that setting. And one of the important ones is to provide opportunities for catch up, because if they're working on group projects or different kinds of activities that take time, they're not going to be completed at the same pace. So it's important that you allow and you accommodate students' different rates of work. And um, another, and I think this is an important one, but one that also makes common is just common sense. Uh, we need to we need to utilize a variety of different activities and then allocate a set amount of time for each activity. And this is really important uh, at the middle school or at the secondary level as well as elementary. There needs to be a variety of ways that we access learning and we teach students. Now what I want to do is I want to shift to school-wide rules and expectations. You see here an umbrella. Umbrella is figurative of school-wide rules, and most of the schools that you go into today have rules that are common across the entire building. And classroom rules and expectations then build upon those. Some guidelines for classroom rules and expectations are that you want to select the fewest number of rules possible. Apply those rules to different settings and routines. So we have as few rules possible, and then we look at how we can apply and generalize those across different settings, different routines. We want to state them behaviorally, and they need to be enforceable. If we want students to walk, then that's something that we would need to enforce. Okay, so we need to be able to observe it and to be able to contingently reinforce that behavior when we see it happening. Okay, we want rules stated positively. Don't tell students what not to do, tell students what you want them to do. Okay, and this is going to make it very, very clear to them as to what those expectations are. Stating in the negative doesn't tell me what your expectations are, just what they're not. Okay, your rules need to be reasonable. Okay, so for example, one of the rules that you would never find in my classroom was you have to raise your hand before talking. Here's why. I was not good at enforcing that rule, and consequently, it wasn't a reasonable one for me to have as a rule in my classroom. I defined being respectful and waiting your turn differently and then raising your hand, because more than once within a day I would be caught talking to a student who talked out and didn't raise their hand. So I found other ways to work around this. Okay. Some teachers, they can enforce that, and it's reasonable within the context of their classroom. Fine. But that's what you have to decide as a teacher and a classroom of students. The other thing is that you need to have consistent consequences for rule fulfillment or infractions. What are you going to do if problem behavior occurs? How are you going to contingently reinforce the appropriate behavior that occurs? You need to think all of these things out ahead of time and be able to communicate this to your students. So let's look at a school-wide rule, and then let's operationalize that to fit within a classroom. So here's a school-wide rule. Be safe. A common one that you're going to see in many schools. Okay, we can define what be safe means within the context of a classroom setting. And the other thing that we want to do, besides just define it, is we want to identify the role and responsibility of both the student and the teacher. So, as we look at this, the student responsibility is to keep his hands, feet, and objects to himself. Okay, that's a typical way that we define safe. Okay, the teacher's responsibility in entering the classroom is that she teach safety habits and procedures. That means that she puts away her things. She stands at the door to ensure that as students walk in, they do so orderly and they put away their materials and they get to their seats. Okay, this is also a responsibility in terms of teaching self control, teaching students how to walk rather than run into the classroom, how to move quickly but quietly within that classroom setting. And finally, the teacher's responsibility is to recognize appropriate behavior. So, see, as I look at this, it's not just that we want to define what the student will do. It's also important to keep in mind what is the teacher's responsibility within the context of that rule, that setting, and what we're asking students to do. Here's another example for entering the classroom. Respect self and others. Students are to walk in, speak softly, put away belongings, take assigned seats. Very reasonable, and again, those are very specific to entering the classroom. Okay, that is what respect self and others looks like when we walk into the room. On the other side, we talk about the teacher responsibility. One is to stand at the door. This is a really important one. Okay, if I'm standing at the door, I can greet students as they walk in. I can navigate them toward the areas they need to be. If they don't have all of their materials, I can send them back to get them. Okay, and it just allows me to both observe within the classroom and right outside the classroom. Okay, really important strategy for teachers to develop and use on a regular basis. Uh, this would be a time that I would refrain from a lot of conversation with students because I want them to come in quietly. Okay, have I would make sure that I have an established area for them to put away their belongings, and the other thing is again to really recognize appropriate behavior as they're walking into the room and putting away their things. I can comment on their respectful behavior. Okay, you have a practice activity that I had posted up online, and so this is a good time to take it out and to practice writing some rules, the expectations for both the student and the teacher, and then I will also post feedback related to that later on so you can look at your answers and compare them. All right, now what we're going to do is we're going to shift to classroom management and we're going to look at an instructional approach. Here are the guiding principles of an instructional approach to classroom management. We teach and manage social behavior. So, again, this is something that we plan to do. We integrate social and academic management strategies within and across the curricula, and we look at the intensity and specialization um, and the level of that based upon the instructional management within the classroom and errors that may become chronic. Here's the secret though. If I am proactive and I teach and manage those social behaviors and I integrate that practice across the day, chances are I will have very few behavioral errors occurring within my classroom. Okay. So, what are the steps to implementing the rules? Here's an instructional approach. First step, teach. Identify, explain the rules. Model, demonstrate relevant examples and non-examples. So we want to show and tell students what is appropriate, or this is an example of the expectation or rule. This is an example of what that expectation or rule is not. Then we provide some practice, and that might be in role play or behavioral rehearsal. We remind students, and we need to do this frequently at the onset of an activity, um, and periodically throughout the day in terms of what that behavior or that rule should look like. And we need to monitor students, provide feedback, collect data to see if our plan is working. Finally, we evaluate and use that information to determine if there are additional steps we need to take or follow up. Okay, here's an example. Mr. Wyoming develops a lesson plan. Okay, Mr. Wyoming is a fifth grade teacher, and his target setting is a whole group instruction. And the rule that he wants his students to follow is follow directions the first time. Pretty reasonable. Okay, he provides a rationale to the students as to why this is important. Okay, following directions the first time is important because of safety, effectiveness, timeliness, and he can define each of um, those different components to the student. Okay, he shares with them what the expectations are for them as well as the expectations for himself. So again, he wants students to understand it's not that they are to do this on their own. He too has a role in ensuring that rules are followed the first time. He demonstrates the steps for, okay, this is an example of that you can use, a teaching example for what following directions may look like or not look like. So here he shares that um, he is demonstrating the steps for designing and wiring a complete circuit that will enable students to turn a bulb on and off. During the demonstration, Leroy is busy drawing unrelated pictures and passing them to friends. Is this following directions? Why or why not? Okay, so he can provide this example and then have the students share if this is following directions. Here's another example. Mr. Wyoming requests that students work in pairs. Students are to draw a map of the country that demonstrates the primary agricultural crops in the region in which they're grown. Sally raises her hand and asks for clarification on the choices of country. Upon receiving an answer, she quickly locates a partner and begins to work. Is this following directions? Why or why not? Again, allowing some discussion around what following the directions looks like, doesn't look like. Okay. After that, the class plays a game, and it's Simon Says variation of it, in which they're going to listen, follow directions. They have a scorecard. They keep track of it, and then they share strategies with Mr. Wyoming on how um, he can use strategies he can use for obtaining and maintaining attention during his directions. The students do a frequency count of the times that they follow it. Mr. Wyoming is also keeping a tally, and then they compare. They play a match game at the end of the day to see if they are close to the same number of marks. And they set a goal for the next day as to how many they're going to need. Okay. The other thing that Mr. Wyoming does is he prompts students at the beginning of lesson, and he points to the scorecard on the whiteboard. That's typically all he does. And then he states, someone share with the class how I can tell if you're listening and ready to follow directions. So again, he's reminding the students, he's having them engaged in this activity. Remember, I'm going to give instructions only once. Give me your full attention. Bill will know what to do because he is quiet and has his eyes on me. Thank you. Here, Mr. Wyoming is giving explicit, specific feedback to a student, telling that student what he is doing that is following directions. Very important. Um, Mr. Wyoming's also going to monitor and reward points. He has the student self evaluate. And again, he provides specific praise to students. Beth, your eyes are on me while I gave instructions. You quickly started working. Thank you. He's going to prompt students when he gives the direction to the class. He's going to observe if they comply. He'll record those points. He can come up with a percentage of points earned, report it to the students at the end of the day. Pretty simple procedure, but again, this is making it very cognizant to the students, and it's occurring across the day. So everyone is working on this idea that following directions the first time is important. Uh, when we talk about secondary students, what we want to do is we're probably not going to go into as much detail. Okay, secondary students should have learned the rules. And so, what we're going to do is remind them of the rules and expectation. But the really critical part here, though we're not going to explicitly teach it, is that we must reinforce the appropriate behavior and evaluate how they're doing. Okay, so I've got a statement in italics down here, and this is a really important one for us to remember. Do not underestimate the student need for ongoing reminders, supervision, and feedback in order to establish classroom expectations. Very important, irregardless whether the child is 3 years old or 18 years old. We have to give that feedback and we have to acknowledge how they're doing. So you have on your worksheet opportunity to practice teaching an expectation. So you can go ahead and stop this video, complete that activity, and then, as I said before, I will post some feedback on what that might look like. Okay, classroom procedures is the final piece to this. So we need to teach the rules. We need to, well, first we have to establish what the rules and expectations are. We teach the rules, and then we want to look also at classroom procedures. And we want to teach classroom procedures much in the same way that we teach the rules and expectation. Okay, this is going to make our day go much smoother, and it's going to allow for optimum learning if we have procedures in place. Okay, so the definition here would be routine activities completed by the student with a minimum assistance from the teacher. And this is an important piece because students need to learn to do these things on their own. And even with younger children, there are some procedures that, if they practice them often enough, they should be able to do independently. And the goal is to have the student manage these tasks by themselves. Okay, so once I've established the classroom procedures and routines for my class, then what I want to do is have students learn some self-management skills. So how can they manage those skills on their own? And one of the things that is important for us to keep in mind is that the classroom assumes a relaxed, orderly environment conducive to teaching and learning. So if everyone follows those procedures, it's going to build a much more orderly environment for learning. Okay, we're going to use those same procedures as we did for teaching expectation. And the critical step in establishing procedures is to be very clear on the behavior expected of the student and to teach those routines formally early in the school year. So, what does it look like to enter the classroom? What does it look like to keep your desk clean and free from clutter on the floor? Important. Uh, as a middle school teacher, one of the things that I found was that I didn't teach the first time around, but I learned from, was that when I had a substitute, that students needed to keep the room as clean and orderly as when I was there. When I was gone and I would come back, their work would be hanging out of their folder, the books would be tossed on the shelf, and so we needed to practice how to put our things away, how to return the room to um, into the same condition as when they walked in there in the morning, irregardless of whether or not I, as their teacher, was there or there was a substitute. So, the big idea here is to design structure and function of the classroom and increase the predictability and accommodate individuals and the collective needs of the students. Okay, in our next lecture, what we'll do is we're going to look at opportunity to practice three, and I will provide some examples of how to put together the expectation matrices as well as the lesson plans for teaching the behaviors.